morning, everyone, and welcome to this event on the Sudan crisis and how it will affect the MENA region. I am LUCIA RAGAZZI, Research Fellow at the Africa Program at ISPI. Before we start, let me remind you that this event is part of the year-long initiative which will lead us to the Rome Med Dialogues, the annual conference on the wider Mediterranean region co-promoted by ISPI and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the International Cooperation. This year conference, which will be at its 9th edition, will be from the 2nd to the 4th of November. So, as you know, Sudan is facing a dramatic moment. We are now into the 4th week of fighting between two factions, let's say, of the armed forces. The Sudanese armed forces, led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, and the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, led by Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, also widely known as MENA. This comes after pivotal years for Sudan. In 2019, popular protests led to the end of the rule of Omar al-Bashir, who had controlled the country for 30 years. The democratic transition, however, ran up against a coup in October 2021, and now seems further away as ever. The toll of the fighting, just an estimation, is very high: 700 casualties, 5,000 wounded. The number of international displaced persons and refugees is on the hundreds of thousands. There have been many attempts for a ceasefire. However, they proved widely unsuccessful. And attempts for a truce talk are currently underway in the Saudi city of Jeddah. However, the spiral of violence has not stopped. Only a few months ago, this region had seen the end of a conflict in the Ethiopian region of Tigray, and now this conflict is again making neighboring countries worry about the implications on their security and interests. The implication on the wider region will be the focus of our discussion today. There are many points to look at to understand the situation. What are the possible effects on neighboring countries? How will regional ties be affected? What to expect from mediation efforts? We will be asking these questions to our guests. I'm very happy to introduce to you IMAD HARB, Director of Research and Analysis at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C., ANDREAS KRIEG, Senior Lecturer at the School of Security Studies at King's College of London and the Royal College of Defense Studies, and SARA Simone, Researcher at the School of International Studies at the University of Trento. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here with us today. Our discussion will last about 45 minutes. I should remind the audience that you have the possibility to ask questions via the chat. Now, to get started on our conversation, I would like to start with SARA Simone, researcher at the University of Trento. SARA, let's talk about the power struggle that is going on in Khartoum. Fighting in Sudan can be essentially traced to the conflict between two major personalities, al-Burhan and Hemeti. Two very different military men in terms of the roles and network of alliances, and they seem, as things have been going on these days, more intent on victory against the opponent rather than on a political solution. Could you please explain what the interests of these two figures are and why a mediation between them is proving so difficult? SARA, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Yes, indeed, there are two very different characters to this story. So Al-Burhan, who is the chairperson of the Sovereign Council, that was the organ that was supposed to lead the transition after the Sudan Revolution in 2019, used to be an army general even during Omar al-Bashir's regime, before he was deposed. He is a man of the establishment of the military establishment of Sudan. Whereas Hemeti is more of an outsider. He used to be the leader of an armed militia in Darfur, which became known as the Janjaweed. It was basically an ethnic-based militia in Darfur that was employed by Omar al-Bashir's regime to fight rebellions in Darfur since 2003. And it then became institutionalized in the Rapid Support Forces, as we call them today. It's a paramilitary body in 2013. So these two generals they were allied. They ran a coup together in 2021 to depose the government, the civil government that was leading the democratic transition, the one that was headed by Abdallah Hamdok, based on a common interest that they had. And the common interest was that they did not want to go back to a civil government. They did not want the democratic transition, both because this would entail that they would lose their power, their military power, and also they would lose their wealth, because both of them have been using their positions in the military and in the paramilitary group to create widespread and deeply reaching economic networks. For Al-Burhan and the Sudanese army, generally speaking, it's about controlling companies and firms in a multiplicity of sectors in the Sudanese economy. Whereas for METI and the RSF, it's more about controlling gold mining in Darfur. So this was their common interest. But of course, when it comes to what they really want to do now that they're fighting, their interests, their ambitions became quite incompatible, because both of them feel that they have to win a military victory in order to survive, both politically and also militarily. Al-Burhan, being a man of the establishment, aims to re-centralize power. This would entail absorbing the rapid support forces into the Sudanese army. And METI does not agree with this idea. And so, of course, both of them have been building international relations aimed at strengthening their own position. And ultimately, this is what led to the clash. So basically, that they were aiming to two different modes of power management within the country.
Thank you, Sara, for this introduction, also to these main characters that are determining basically what is happening in Khartoum right now, which of course goes well beyond the borders of Sudan. Sudan is surrounded by 7 countries, and we keep repeating these days. So what happens in Khartoum has direct implication on the region. One of the countries that is, of course, following closely the development in Sudan is Egypt, who is a close neighbor of Sudan and has been long linked to Sudanese affairs. And for looking at the Egyptian perspective and turning to HARB, IMAD, since the outbreak of the conflict, Cairo is maintaining a cautious approach. Could you please explain to us what is Egypt's relation with the two contending generals, Al-Burhan and Hemeti, and amounting to the crisis, how is the conflict affecting Egypt's interest in Sudan and Cairo's relationship with these two personalities? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. You know, what's going on is really heart-rending and really very, very difficult. You know, this situation is extremely complicated. Egypt looks at Sudan as it is its backyard. Nothing happens in Sudan that's not going to influence what happens inside Egypt and what happens with Egypt's foreign policy. There is, you know, the country is basically Egypt's strategic depth, and the two countries have always had close relations. The Egyptian leaders have always counted on their Sudanese friends, leaders, to really have Egypt's interests at heart. This is specifically very, very important for Egypt, not only for its own domestic security, obviously, and not for its relations with Sudan, but also because of the repercussions it might have on the Libya situation. You know, Libya is in chaos, and Egypt does not necessarily need another file, another problem on its border to deal with. We're talking about Egypt is also worried about the security interests. One of those is the issue of refugees, potential refugees who might flood Egypt, come into Egypt. According to the UNHCR, anywhere between 800,000 or a million Sudanese may become refugees because of the ongoing conflict. There also is a problem. Egypt is really worried about the situation, the domestic situation, internal situation in Sudan, where a lot is being said about partition. I mean, can Sudan really go for to become partitioned into 3 or 4 or 5 different countries, so to speak? In 2011, Sudan lost South Sudan because of really bad policies in Khartoum. But should this conflict continue, there is great danger that the country may be partitioned, may break up into different units. This is really very important for Egypt. It increases the security worries, the security danger on Egypt. There is also we're also talking about Sudan as part of Egypt's maritime security, the Red Sea littoral, all the way from the Gulf of Aden to the Suez Canal. This is really Egypt's maritime strategic depth. So what happens in Sudan is definitely very important for Egypt. We also know that there is a problem with the Halayeb Triangle between Egypt and Sudan, and Egypt would like some sort of a solution on it, on that. And any chaos within Sudan means that this conflict continues, this dispute over the territory continues. We're also talking about Egypt's relying on Sudan to help it in the stand on Ethiopia's GERD, the Grand Renaissance Dam. This is serious business, a matter of survival for Egypt. If Sudan breaks up, Egypt has no assurance whatsoever that it will have somebody on its side to help it with the situation. Although it appears over the last year or so things have quieted down a little bit, but it is, as far as I'm concerned, it is still an ongoing concern for the Egyptians. Also, we were in its relations with Burhan and Hameti. I think that Egypt is in a bind, really. Whom does it support? I think whoever comes on top, Egypt will make amends with, will be friends with, and the important part for Egypt is the security, the unity, the territorial integrity of Sudan, and whoever comes on top is liable to be the one who is in charge of the country's security and the country's unity.
Thank you, IMAD, for this comprehensive overview of what's worrying Cairo these days. I would like to continue our browsing of regional actors to add on this perspective that we have seen on the worries of Egypt about vis-a-vis the Sudanese situation. I would like to broaden our focus beyond the Red Sea, and I'm turning to ANDREAS KRIEG for this exercise, let's say. ANDREAS, Gulf actors, especially Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, have been major partners of Sudan in the last years of the al-Bashir rule, but they have continued to be so also during Khartoum's long and difficult transition in the past few years. What is at stake for these two countries? How might their interests be harmed if Sudan continues in its path of instability?
Yeah, thank you for having me. It is a very complex conflict because there are so many different layers that need to be understood also from a Gulf point of view, because there isn't really a singular way for them to engage Sudan since 2018, 2019. So in 2018, 2019, the UAE and Saudi Arabia were still cooperating very closely. We were at the height of the Gulf crisis. There was a lot of policy that was directed against Turkey, against Iran, against Qatar. And this is really when the two were kind of strategically working together in the region. And Sudan was one of these areas because of where it is located, strategic location in terms of the Red Sea, in terms of, Arab versus sub-Saharan Africa, these kind of sphere of influence colliding. They saw an opportunity to kind of bring in a secular military leadership, an authoritarian security sector-led sort of institutional setup that could bring about what they thought about would be more stability than what was the last remaining years of al-Bashir, where you had a lot of militias, where you had a lot of different Islamist factions on the ground as well. And that was kind of the project, is kind of returning Sudan to a more centralized sort of military-led sort of dictatorship, as they've tried to push in other parts of the Middle East. But for both of them, both the UAE and Saudi Arabia look at Sudan through the lens of stability, and obviously their security narrative of how to create stability is slightly different from other countries, and hence their understanding of stability has been that of military or security sector based social political setups. Or governance, and hence why they've both engaged both sides of that divide that Sarah was talking about, Burhan and Hemeti in particular. The UAE obviously being closer to Hemeti and the RSF, being a major conduit for the growth of the RSF into the powerhouse that they are today, and then the Saudis being slightly closer to the Sudanese armed forces. But also here, the Saudis have kind of pivoted away from Sudan over the last couple of years as the focus has been more on internal affairs, leaving the UAE as the absolutely most important broker and a sort of powerhouse in Sudan. Both Saudi and the UAE want to present themselves as conduits for great power interests, in particular towards the United States, but also towards China and Russia. All of them have interest in Sudan. All of them have an interest in the Horn of Africa. And I would say that Africa has somewhat become, particularly the Horn of Africa, has become a growth area of growth for their strategic depth for most of the Gulf countries, including Qatar. But obviously Qatar has been somewhat withdrawn from Sudan after the revolution and after consecutive coups that happened afterwards. And also what needs to be understood is that Abu Dhabi and Riyadh are no longer on the same page on pretty much any strategic issue in the region. We've seen increased competition over economic access to FDI, competition over leadership in particular. And I think we need to see Sudan from a Gulf perspective, at least. We have to look at Sudan through the lens of political leadership and regional leadership. And the Saudis have, over the last year or so, really tried to outgrow the United Arab Emirates, trying to no longer give a room for the smaller, quote unquote, Gulf states to kind of take initiatives, but to actually lead initiatives. We've seen that on Syria. We've seen it on Yemen. We've seen it on Iran. And I think the Saudis are now looking at Sudan through the same lens of saying, this is an opportunity for us to actually show leadership. And the Saudis have been less assertive and more pragmatic than the Emiratis when they are engaging different actors in the region. And therefore, I think they have a lot more credibility in that respect. And now stability for them, both of them, is about making sure that the fighting between the different factions stops. But I think the reason for the Saudis is obviously geographically they're a lot more proximate to Sudan. They're just across the Red Sea. Stability in Sudan is not a luxury issue. Directly concerns maritime security for the Saudis. For the Emiratis, it's obviously geographically more removed, but the UAE are the key stakeholder and broker in the Horn of Africa and in Northern Africa, with a multi-vector, multi-layered approach to developing networks. So on the front, on the surface, we have a direct UAE engagement pushing for stability and diplomatic solutions through the state institutions. But below the surface, the Emiratis have obviously built a massive, extensive network involving private individuals, private corporations, mercenaries, involving Russian intermediaries, involving actors in Libya, involving actors from Yemen. And that kind of intricate network, I call this network-centric statecraft, is a much broader approach than the Saudis have. It is a much broader approach than any other actor has. And so whatever solution you're trying to find in Sudan, you will have to get the Emiratis or the intermediaries involved. So the Emiratis have to have, a lot of leverage over trade and trade corridors. They have an interest in kind of developing supply chains into Sudan and also across the Red Sea. They have an interest, they have invested into the military, but also into the paramilitary forces of the RSF. They've delivered arms to both sides. They have used intermediaries such as the LNA to deliver the arms. They have funded Wagner Group and allowed Wagner Group to kind of extract resources from Sudan and bring it to market via the UAE, thereby, putting the Russians into the mix. So whatever way you look at it at the moment, there is actually really no way around UAE influence. Even if you cut one node out of the network, you will have so many other layers, so many different nodes in the network that all run through the UAE. And that is a very important thing to understand as we move forward, because the Emiratis do have leverage that they can use if they chose to do so. But I think at the moment, they're sitting there and seeing who's going to win. And like the Egyptians, I think the Emiratis are pragmatic enough to choose whoever is going to come out victoriously. So whether it's Hemeti or Burhan, I think they have a degree of flexibility, although I think they have wedded themselves quite considerably to the Hemeti side.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. A lot of elements on the table, a lot of layers, a lot of connections, a lot of things to look at. Let's complete the picture, or at least try to do so. Both Andreas and IMAD have mentioned also the Horn of Africa, the whole of the region in terms of connection that we have to take into account to fully understand this chessboard. And I would like to complete this picture by looking at the regional element in Africa. I'm turning again to SARA de Simone to do so, because Sudan, as we mentioned, is one of the largest countries in Africa, third in size, and it's indeed in a position of a crossroads. It's between Northern Africa and the Great Lake area, between the Sahel with Chad on one side, and the Horn of Africa with Ethiopia on the other side. So for some, Sudan would be too big to fail, and that's maybe part of the reason why these other actors are taking a pragmatic approach, because a power vacuum in the country is a pretty scary scenario for neighboring countries. So what are the main concerns for these countries in the region that we have mentioned in terms of their stability and interests? Please, Sarah, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, as Andreas mentioned, stability is the major concern of all the actors in the region. The region of the Horn of Africa, the larger Horn of Africa, is an extremely unstable region. So, of course, the collapse of Sudan means is a great threat to the stability of an area that has already a lot of situations of instability, and that has in many cases states that are not capable of controlling their peripheries, their borders. So the borders are porous. So when it comes to the countries bordering Sudan, on the west, we have Chad and the Central African Republic. Both of them find themselves in situations of difficulty because of internal problems. Central African Republic has been living through waves of violence for years, and Chad has been in mayhem since Idris Deby died in 2021. So it's still has not stabilized itself yet. The first consequence of what is going on in Sudan is massive influx of refugees towards these areas. These areas are already unstable, and they're also receiving large amounts of people. That will mean increasing demographic pressures in a situation of limited resources, and also a great increase in the circulation of small arms, for example, which of course is one of the first ways that these kind of conflicts spill over. With Chad, there is also an additional dimension that concerns the original ethnic composition of the Janjaweed militia, which was then turned into the Rapid Support Forces. That was a group of people that used to live on the border between Chad and Sudan. So there are, for example, rumors that Emeti might have been born in Chad, for example. So there are really a lot of relations that really go beyond the relations at state level, I would say. On the other side, on the eastern side, we have Ethiopia. And as IMAD was mentioning, Ethiopia is one of the countries that is involved in this big issue of the negotiation concerning the use of the Nile water, because Ethiopia has been building a huge dam right on the border with Sudan, and so Sudan has been an important actor in the discussions that have been ongoing with Egypt, with the riverine countries, basically to see how to operate this dam once the unilateral decision of building it was made by Ethiopia. Of course, with Sudan in this situation, this is a problem very much for Egypt, as Imad was saying, but also to Ethiopia, because instability at the border also means that there is no clear actor to negotiate with, to talk to, and indeed Ethiopia is also maintaining a very kind of neutral approach without taking sides at the moment, and seeing who will who will start emerging as a victor in the military confrontation, in order to make sure that whoever wins, whoever emerges as the next ruler of Sudan, they will be able to interact in a profitable way for the country. And then, of course, there is South Sudan, which was formerly a part of Sudan itself, that seceded in 2011 after a referendum, after a very long civil war with Sudan. And South Sudan also has, I think it's probably one of the countries that is fearing the most what is going on in Sudan, mostly because its whole economy is based on oil extraction, but the oil is only exported from South Sudan at the moment through a pipe, through an oil pipe that runs through Sudan. And so if that oil pipe would ever become a military target in this confrontation, this would also mean a very big economic and financial problem to South Sudan.
Thank you, Sara, for giving us all these elements on the neighboring countries of Sudan. Well, many things to look at. Of course, the refugee crisis is one of the most immediate major concerns right now, on top of all the strategic interests to keep in mind. The refugee crisis, which is affecting basically all of the neighboring countries of Sudan. According to UN estimates, we are now into the 150,000 of refugees on top of the 700,000 internally displaced persons. And most of these people are going to Egypt. Estimations are, again, about 70,000 people crossing into Egypt right now. So this is one of the many things that are putting pressure to Cairo, and it's actually to Egypt that I would like to go back again with IMAD HARB, because IMAD, before you gave us a pretty thorough perspective on what is adding pressure on Cairo these days. So refugee crisis is one of the many, many things, along with all the others that you have mentioned. How is Cairo preparing to these challenges now? Also in terms of promoting a mediation, is it in touch with the fighting parties? Does it have the authority to be an actor in these mediation efforts? Please. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Lucia. The refugee issue is just one of those issues. Obviously, whenever you have a displaced community, you have big problems. Not only for the community itself, but also for the host country. We're talking about Egypt that is undergoing some very difficult economic times. The country is the economy. I wouldn't say the economy is on the verge of collapse, but we're talking about serious economic issues. High unemployment, exchange rate that is every few months it collapses by double digits percentages. The IMF is trying to basically bail out the Egyptian economy. Considering the problem with the Egyptian economy is it's not a regular economy of scale. It's an economy that's controlled by the military institution. And how does a military military-led state curb the interference of the military institution in the economy? So Egypt is really in a very bad situation today. Not only because of the overwhelming role that the military plays in the Egyptian economy, but also because the economy itself is not necessarily a successful economy. The economic principles of the state have always been the wrong principles. So add to that concerns about security issues. Add to that concerns about what happens with the water situation. So this is really very serious for Egypt. As far as negotiations is concerned, I mean, I am positive that the Egyptians tried to negotiate between the two generals, but I think they just simply failed because they do not have the influence that other actors. Andreas was talking about the UAE and Saudi Arabia. They are the ones who have the most influence over what happens with the two generals. Egypt tried to interfere, actually did not like the framework agreement that was agreed last December to prepare for a transfer of power to civilians in Sudan. They came in and they proposed their own plan. So they are trying to force the Sudanese to do certain things that are in Egypt's interest, but in the negotiation process today, I don't think that Egypt really plays much of a role. Egypt needed to ask the UAE to intervene on its behalf to release the, I think, like 177 soldiers or something like that, that the Rapid Security Forces, RSFs, Hameti's forces have had imprisoned. So Egypt again is in a bind. It cannot really support either of the two gentlemen vying for power, and yet at the same time it cannot really lift its hand off of Sudan today.
Thank you, Imad. Let's continue reflecting on these mediation efforts, because as we speak, mediation efforts are underway. Actually, they are more of a truce talk that have started on Saturday and are still ongoing in the Saudi city of Jeddah with representatives from the warring parties. Andreas, KRIEG, I'm going back to you to comment on this, because you've mentioned that some countries in the Gulf are taking this opportunity of leadership, and Saudi Arabia has been leading efforts to secure ceasefires over these weeks, and it was also a protagonist of evacuation of civilians, many of which went to Jeddah, actually, through the Red Sea. What is your take on what is the path for these diplomatic measures to end the crisis? What should we expect on this mediation and in the days ahead, please?
Yeah, thank you. I think the effort is very commendable to see that Saudi Arabia is trying to play a constructive role in a way that it probably hasn't done for years, if not decades. I mean, it's Saudi Arabia is probably, in terms of real power influence, power base, you look at the size of the country, probably should be the most important actor in the region. Also because it came out, as other Gulf countries, as fairly stable and victorious after the Arab Spring. So it's good to see them trying to play a more constructive role in terms of humanitarian aid, brokering, trying to be a broker and a mediator. The issue is that we're in a situation where I think the conflict is not ripe for mediation or negotiation. Both sides still think they can win on the battlefield. We see every single truce or ceasefire agreement broken. Also because, particularly on the RSF side, the RSF is not a military. It doesn't have a united, integrated chain of command, which means it's very difficult for decisions that are made on the top to actually trickle down to the tactical level, making sure that squads on the ground are actually listening to what's been centrally decided. It's a network of different actors. And that's a part of the problem. I think what we've seen over the last couple of years happening in Sudan, particularly since 2019, is that the UAE have built networks outside of the official institutional setup that is now involved in these negotiations. The Saudis, on the other hand, have usually used direct channels, state on state, have used investments, have engaged with the military mostly, despite their relationship with the RSF as well. But they haven't really built any networks that could potentially undermine the integrity of the state institutions. And what we see effectively happening now is that you have Hemeti, who is a very dubious character if you look at his track record, if you look at his human rights abuses, potential allegations of genocide, who acts as a non-state actor, but acts as a state within the state in many ways because of the wealth that he's been generated. And most of that wealth has been generated through the use of and the aid of Russia and the UAE. He's got great power buy-in from Russia. He's got the support from the UAE. Most of his networks, social media networks, as well as media campaigns are run through the UAE. So he feels very empowered. And if you then look at the people who were represented in Saudi Arabia in Jeddah last weekend, these were very minor, not really high profile sort of delegations. So again, that shows and suggests that both sides are not entirely eager to come to a truth because they feel like the time is not ripe for mediation. And they've said it, actually. They've said the time is not ripe for a solution. But it even suggests that the time is not ripe to even work on a ceasefire at this point. And, Saudi Arabia's leverage is limited. Saudi Arabia has actually withdrawn itself from the conflict a little bit over the last couple of years. And if Hemeti had been less empowered through military aid, financial aid, information aid, I think if the UAE would really put an end to this and say it's either you stick with us and you stick with the Quad's view, UK, US, Saudi, UAE view on stability, or else if you don't do that, we will withdraw all our aid. I think that would actually have an impact on his ability to act and willingness to commit to a ceasefire. I don't see that happening at the moment. I think the UAE are playing a game of duality where they have an official strategic engagement with other Quad parties, but under the table operationally have used private networks to continue engaging all parts of the conflict and thereby empowering all parts of the conflict, and especially breaking the conflict away from just being this kind of duality that we've been talking about, or this kind of bipolar relationship between these two gentlemen, Burhan and Hemeti, into a far more complex network of different actors. And that's part of the problem. Why would these people now sit around the negotiation table? I don't think we're at the point yet where the conflict is ripe for negotiation.
Thank you, Andreas. Well, all of these inputs give us quite a complex perspective on understanding this network of interests and on the days ahead. And we have received some inputs from our audience. We've been receiving some questions, so I would like to dedicate the last few minutes to these questions, because they allow us to broaden the focus a little bit further on their international dimension. The first of these questions is, one of the readers wrote, what has been the US role in the Sudan conflict so far? What are Washington's main options to mitigate the crisis, to prevent a long period of disintegration in Sudan and further in the region? I would like probably to turn to IMAD HARB. Do you have any comments on that?
Yes, thank you. It's very, very strange talking about the U.S. role in Sudan, or the U.S. Hoped for role in Sudan. The U.S. withdrawal, not necessarily withdrawal, but a hands-off approach to the Sudanese issue since 2019, the toppling of Omar al-Bashir. It really calls into question what the U.S. foreign policy towards Sudan, or actually towards East Africa, or even the whole continent is like. The United States does not, obviously, is against a civil war in Sudan. It's against what's going on between these two generals. But the United States seems to have ceded its role to other actors, specifically the Gulf actors, specifically Saudi Arabia. But as Andreas cogently argues, even Saudi Arabia may not be able to influence these two guys to really stop the fighting, because it's not probably time for them to reach a ceasefire or find a solution for the conflict. The United States has spoken on both sides of its mouth, so to speak. It has, supported democratic development in Sudan, the democratic transition to a civilian government, but yet at the same time, hardly said anything when the generals toppled Abdullah Hamdok when he became the prime minister. So they know what they want, but they don't know what they want. They can influence things, but they are not influencing things. And this, I might add that this might be a reflection of a lessened U.S. role in the Middle East in general, and in in East Africa also as well.
Thank you. Thank you. We also have received a question about Russia, which I think would be interesting to add another element to the whole perspective. What is Russia's role in Sudan today? How are Moscow's interests related to the crisis between the armed factions in the country? So I think I will turn to SARA to answer this question. I mean, there is too much to say for only a few minutes left, but would you like to give us some elements?
Yes. Okay, I think Russia has been involved in Sudan for a very long time through the Wagner Group, but also negotiating for the control of important infrastructures, for example, the construction of a naval base at Port Sudan, the control of the port in Port Sudan. The Wagner Group has been involved in the country mostly as an economic partner of METI, of the Rapid Support Forces, in the extraction of gold. So the Wagner Group has been the single biggest purchaser of the Darfurian gold, in exchange of which it brought arms, it brought weapons to the group. So of course there is a big presence presence of Russia in the country and also in the neighboring countries, in the Central African Republic. And of course, it has a very big role, the Wagner Group in the Sahel. I don't think Russia or the Wagner Group had a very big interest in creating this kind of crisis, because it was already doing business with any government that came to power in Sudan. Of course, now that the crisis has exploded, it might need to choose a side, and there are these very strong links with the Rapid Support Forces. But I don't think there is evidence at the moment that there is one of the factions that is really heavily supported by Russia against the other. Despite the very strong presence of the Wagner Group in the country.
Thank you, Sara. Let's take one latest question. I will turn to Andreas for these. The question from the listener is that there were reports, there were reports of Khalifa Haftar from Libya sending military supplies to the RSF after years of the RSF supporting Haftar in Libya. So what is going on? Is there a turnaround?
Yeah, I mean, so the evidence is still kind of shaky on this. What we know is that there have been transport planes going from Libya into RSF-controlled territory. We don't know what was on board. We don't know how many weapons, whether it was weapons or supplies. But I would still, and I wrote about it recently, I think I would look at this as a carousel of different actors and that the UAE have built up in this part of the world. The LNA and Haftar being a very important proxy of UAE interest in Northern Africa, and he's been a major conduit also for the Russians and for Wagner Group's actual establishment in Northern Africa, which they then used to go into Sudan. So in the past, we know Haftar has used, first of all, has used roughly 1,000 RSF fighters in Libya, but also in other respects has helped RSF forces to be trained by Russians in Libya. So it's a very intricate sort of relationship where both sides kind of help each other. And it would not be out of the ordinary. Both Haftar and Hemeti kind of fight for the same narrative, which is the UAE's narrative of getting rid of political Islam. And I think we've seen that in Hemeti's first speech, where he was saying we're trying to rid the country of Islamist thugs, which is the same narrative the UAE has used in Libya and in Sudan. And the same narrative that Haftar is using. So they're ideologically aligned, there are interest alignments, and there's obviously a partnership where both sides have helped each other. And in the past, we also still are tracking the weapons and how these weapons, the thermal blast weapons, arrived in Sudan. And there are very strong suggestions that they were dumped by the UAE in Libya in 2021, and then were transported into Sudan. The question is, to what extent is that carousel still moving, and to what extent are weapons still being transferred from Libya to Sudan at the moment with the consent or without the consent of the UAE?
Okay, thank you, Andreas, and thank you to everybody. We have arrived at the end of the time at disposal for this conversation. Thank you also to everybody in the audience who asked questions, and of course to all the guests for this very interesting discussion. It was a pleasure talking to you and getting more understanding and keeping up the attention on what is going on right now in Sudan. So thank you again to IMAD HARB, Director of Research and Analysis at the Arab Center in Washington, to Andreas KRIEG, Senior Lecturer at the School of Security Studies, King's College London, Royal College of Defence Studies, and Sara De Simone, Researcher at the School for International Studies at the University of Trento. Thank you very much again, and see you soon.